only allowed to come from up here tonight. Before we get started, Trey wanted me to remind everyone that we have the ice cream social this Sunday after our evening service. I wanted to go ahead and mention it because I thought about it. I'll try to mention it again at the end just as a reminder. So we're walking through this portrait of God, and if y'all are here on Wednesday night, Steve's really trying to frame us up for what we do. If you're here on Sunday night, Steve is kind of framing everything up for us so we can really dive into it a little bit more on our Wednesday nights. And so we're going to be looking tonight at how God is setting up His divine redemption for humanity. We're still in Genesis, so we're still all the way back at the beginning, and we're going to be walking through how everything just continues to point to God's plan for us, how everything continues to point us to Jesus as we go. What's really great about this material is, in the Bible in general, is I think we all know that we can read the text one year and read it again the next, and it kind of continues to just speak to us differently. To me, that's how I know it is a living, breathing Word of God, because it just continues to speak truth into your life. But when you kind of look at the same text with a different purpose, it really kind of opens your eyes to a variety of different things. And it's been this is only the first lesson I've had, so it's been a great first study. I'm looking forward to continuing and sharing some of those things with you all as we go. And so we're going to be looking at different pictures of sin tonight and how that sin continues to allow God to point us to His purposes for redemption. Genesis 4 pictures sin really taking root in the first family. We're going to dive into Noah a little bit, and then we'll get to Abraham. So we're going to kind of cover 9 chapters, but we're going to look at 3 stories. And we're going to see how God's redeeming work for sin is playing out all the way back from the beginning. So to get us started, let me read this first story, see what we can pull out of it. Open up to Genesis chapter 4. And I'm going to start in verse 3 and read through verse 8. Genesis 4, verses 3 through 8. And what's great about our study tonight is we know all of these stories. There's nothing I'm going to present to you tonight that we don't know already. Hopefully, though, we can look at it in a little bit different light and gain some truth from God's Word. Genesis 4, starting in verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, you will not be accepted. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. All right. First things first. We have 2 brothers, Cain and Abel, and they are both playing different parts in their role as they provide for the family. What was Abel? What was his job? He's a shepherd. I mean, already the Bible is pointing us to Jesus, right? Cain is the shepherd. He's looking over Abel is the shepherd. He's looking over the flock. Cain, however, was working out in the fields. He worked the grounds. He harvested the crops, the fruit. Quick little side note, I grew up in public schools, and from day one, public schools tell us that man was created 10,000 years ago, and we started out as hunter-gatherers. We just wandered around the earth scavenging for whatever food we can have. This is the first family, and what we have is a commitment to agriculture as well as domesticating animals. All right, so the textbooks that they're teaching us in school are wrong. We were not hunter-gatherers. We were harvesting the wheat, and we were domesticating animals right out of the gate. I thought that was an interesting little side note. So, question. We're looking at sin and God's redemption for sin. Based on what we just read here in chapter 4, how is sin manifesting itself in this story with Cain and Abel? Jealousy. What else? How did Cain respond when God did not accept his offering? He was what? He was angry. Is anger a sin? Especially in a vengeful sense. I think that's probably underlying the pride that Cain had. How about his choice to ignore and disobey God? There's a variety of different ways we see sin being played out here in chapter 4, especially in these offerings that are being brought to God. Cain and Abel bring these offerings, and it's offerings from their labor, right? Abel the shepherd, Cain the one that works the fields. Cain brings an offering of harvest. He brings the fruit of the ground. Abel brings an offering of blood, animal sacrifice. Along with it, he also brings the fat portion, which in this culture and in this time was really a delicacy. It was a luxury, that fat portion. When they would kill the firstborn, they would separate the fat, and they would also take the fat, and the fat was used as a burnt offering. And the Bible describes that burnt offering as a pleasing aroma to God. All right, so what that tells me is that every time I smell a steak on the grill, and it is a sweet aroma that is pleasing to me, that is the same smell that is pleasing to God. God likes the smell of a good steak. Amen. I do too. It's good stuff. I mean, wouldn't God want us to be pleased with the same things He's pleased with? Good ribeye with that fat portion on there, just gristling. Oh, it's good stuff. But we have two sacrifices. We have fruit from the field, and we have the animal sacrifice, which is the blood sacrifice, again, pointing us to Jesus in the blood sacrifice. The Bible also describes not this foreshadowing of Jesus with the lamb, but also the sins and the atonement of sins that Jesus will take away for all of us. But if Jesus was the firstborn lamb, this is also the firstborn lamb of Abel. So we're starting to see these parallels, and we're only in Genesis chapter 4. Okay? So why did God accept Abel's offering and reject Cain's offering? Think about that. Let me read two other verses for you from the New Testament to see if we can get a little bit more information on why Abel's offering was accepted, but Cain's offering was rejected. This is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous. God commended him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, still speaks. All right, so Abel made an offering in faith, and that offering in faith was commended by God and was considered righteous. There's another verse I want to read real quick. And this is from 1 John chapter 3, verse 12. We should not be like Abel, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So let me ask the question again. Why did God accept Abel's offering and reject Cain's offering? Yep, I think that's a big part of it, for sure. What else? Without question. Abel's offering was made in faith, right? And we understand what faith means, and it's this desire to obey God and do what God has called us to do. There's an obedience to faith that we see in Abel's offering. Cain's offering, however, was not accepted, and we see the heart and the attitude of Cain referenced in 1 John, where his deeds were evil. They were of the evil one. They were not done in a way that was righteous. It was done unfaithfully, right? I almost read it like he's just going through the motions. He's just doing just giving whatever he had, right? Right. So we got to be careful too as we bring to God our offerings, our best, that we're not doing it in a way that is not faithful, not religiously faithful. What's interesting here, and I want to, this goes back to what I said earlier, how looking at a text in a different way, really, I'm like Max, I go down a lot of rabbit holes when I put stuff like this together, but it's great because it just gives me a little bit more truth and helps me understand what God's working through and how He's planning for us all the way back from the beginning, this salvation. The word that's used here for offering, and I don't speak Hebrew, I'm guessing it's mincha, M-I-N-C-H-A-H, however you pronounce that in the old language. But that word for offering is really used in the broadest sense of offering, the most generic sense, meaning any offering to God. Okay, so it can include a variety of different offerings, not just a blood offering for the atonement of sin, but also an offering of thanksgiving, an offering of everything. Whatever you have to bring to God as an offering, it is this type of offering. And we know that because it's used in Leviticus chapter 2. Now, what's interesting is we're not in Leviticus chapter 2. We're in Genesis chapter 4. So although it is a generic word for offering, which tells us as we read through the text that perhaps God could accept as a offering of thanksgiving Cain's offering of the harvest. It would be acceptable according to the law. According to the law, that type of offering is acceptable to God. But did God give Cain and Abel any instruction regarding this offering? Did he tell them, I need you to bring this specific type of offering to me? We don't know. So what can we take away from that? How do we apply that? How do we look at that in terms of redeeming power for sin? Because there's no explicit instruction on what God wanted as an offering. However, we do know a few things that we can kind of narrow it down based on what we know from Scripture. At this point, in Genesis chapter 4, there had only been one type of offering to God, and it was the blood sacrifice for the atonement of sin. It's the only one. We have not seen in the text any offering of thanksgiving through wheat, through anything other than bloodshed. Okay? So I think even though the term is generic for offering, I think based on the conversation that God's having with Cain and Abel, the way God lovingly commends Cain, which we'll look at here in just a second, it seems like there's been some instructions that maybe weren't included in the text. Because if you just look at the way offering, you had to meet certain criteria for offerings. They had to be brought in a certain way. They had to be delivered on an altar. There had to be just a bare minimum. Any type of offering to God had to meet a certain criteria. We don't talk about any of that. We just see Cain brings one and Abel brings one. One's accepted, one's rejected. But we know from text, from the Bible as a whole, that there's a variety of other elements that are involved. So when you kind of take those thoughts and you add them with the fact that, all right, Abel was faithful and Cain was not. Abel brought a blood sacrifice for the atonement of sin. Cain just brings an offering of thanksgiving and, thank you for this harvest that you provided for us. He's not really giving anything up. And I found this really great quote from Spurgeon. I don't know if y'all have ever read his stuff. He's pretty incredible. He's an old preacher from England. This is what he said. Cain did not mind bringing to God that which he thought might be acceptable as a return for favors received, but he would not bring to God an acknowledgement of his guilt or a confession of his ability to make atonement for sin. I think that kind of nails down what we're talking about here, why one offering was accepted and one offering was not accepted. But our focus tonight isn't on the offering, it's on the sin. It's on what happens as a result of the rejection of that offering. The Bible says Cain became angry. He was angry because his offering was rejected. It even says that it changed the physical appearance of his face. His face fell, right? To say it another way, they're mad. It's written all over their face. We know whenever we walk in and our spouse has had a rough day and we see their face is not smiling, it is fallen, we know they're having a bad day. They're angry, we tiptoe. Right? We know what that looks like. We know what that means. So, why did Cain become so upset that his sacrifice was rejected? It's interesting. As I'm reading through here, the issue seems to be with the sacrifice more so than anything else. Because Because it's more than just what you put on the altar. It's the heart behind it. It's the attitude behind it. It's the acknowledgement of why I'm doing this. And in this case, it's the acknowledgement of sin and Cain's lack thereof.
And there's nothing worse than knowing that you know at the time what you're supposed to do and the meaning behind it, but you don't do it anyway. There's nothing worse than doing that and then realizing that I should have done that.
Mm-hmm.
I knew better than to do it, and I tried to get away with it, and now I'm not.
That's right.
We think Abel realized who God was, how powerful he is, and what he stands for, and what he represents, and that was in his heart. Whenever Cain knew it, but he wouldn't release it.
Right. One of the things that we don't see here is that God asked Cain and Abel to bring an offering. It just says in the course of time, Cain and Abel bring their offering. So they've done this before, it would appear. They knew what they had to do. They already had the instruction from God. Cain didn't fulfill those obligations. I would argue that that's probably the greatest sin of humanity, that we know better than God. It all boils down to that. Yep, that's great. And so Cain is rebuked because of the sin, and I love what happens next. I mean, God lovingly confronts him, right? Why is your face fallen? Like, Cain, what's wrong, Cain? And he tells him that if his sacrifices would be acceptable if he did well. Right? So he's correcting the sin. I mean, the grace of God is fully on display here. Cain, you messed up. I reject your sacrifice, but if you do well, it will be accepted, right? You'll be forgiven. God warns him even of the dangers of the sin that he's about to continue to fall into and the destructive power that it will cause in his life. And then he gives him a choice. He says, you have a choice to make. And there's consequences to the choice. You can resist the sin and receive the blessing, or you can give in to sin and be devoured. Tragically, Cain chose wrong, and the consequences were unimaginable, right? And I want us to see how quickly this devouring that sin can do to one's life, look how quickly it escalated for Cain. His offering is rejected, he gets upset, and then he kills his brother. I mean, boom, boom, boom. He didn't just despise his brother and lose that relationship and, I'm no longer going to be friends with my brother. I'm not going to work in the fields with my brother. I'm not going to love my brother like I should. We're going to have to work on this relationship and it's going to take years. No. He killed. And the way he did it is, it's frustrating, right? He lures him into the field with casual conversation, and out of nowhere, he springs on him this death blow, and he kills him. Hey, brother, how you doing? How's the sheep going today? Yeah, no, look at this one right here. It's got a problem. Slap over the head with a rock, however that looked, right? He premeditated this murder, and this is the first recording of murder we have in the text. We go from this pride-filled rejection that turns to anger, this fallen face, this rebuke and instruction and an opportunity for forgiveness, to a rejection of God's offering, to, I'm going to kill my brother. And so God sent Cain out of the land. He became a fugitive. He was forced to wander the land. He was cursed in the sense that whatever land he would harvest going forward, that land would no longer yield the power that it did beforehand. So I don't know if that's half as much, a third as much, but nonetheless, he was not getting the full harvest that he was before. Even so that Cain even said, this is too much for me to bear. As I wander, people are going to kill me. And God said, no, I'm not going to let them kill you. If they do, they will be cursed. This is going to be punishment. He landed in Nod. Nod actually means wandering. So Cain maybe became that hunter-gatherer that wandered the earth because he was cursed by God. I don't know. That's just speculation. Nonetheless, the worst part of all of this is that Cain's lack of faith and the punishment that he received for the murder that he committed passed down to his generation that followed. The line that followed Cain became a deprived generation. It became, descendants became sinful. They were not faithful. They did not obey God's law. And it just became sin, compounding sin, compounding sin. And anytime you have sin being multiplied or sinners being multiplied, you have sin being multiplied as well. And so this is the escalation of sin throughout all of humanity. Roll down to Genesis 4, verse 25. We're going to read verse 25 and 26 because this is God's redeeming power again coming into play. We have sin that escalated. We had an opportunity for forgiveness in there. Cain rejected that, killed his brother, but God still continues to offer redemption for those who love him and are faithful to him. Verse 25, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and they called his name Enosh. And at that time the people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So Adam and Eve were blessed with another son, and Seth became a God-fearing man, and all of his descendants followed and trusted in the name of the Lord. They came and they worshiped God. They obeyed God. They lived in harmony and relationship with God. So Cain's descendants went the other way. Here comes Seth, who took the place of Abel and continued this trusting, growing relationship with God. This is the pattern that Steve talked about on Sunday night, this pattern of sin, punishment, and renewal. Cain sinned by murdering his brother. He was punished by being exiled, but God renewed his plan and his purpose for humanity by letting Adam and Eve bore another son in Seth to continue a new line of faithful followers. All right? So that's our first portrait of God. Let's look at the second one. Turn over to Genesis chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 1. Genesis 6, verse 1, we're going to read 1 through 5. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. And they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old and men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, period. All right, so by the time we get to Genesis 6, we see that the population on the earth is rapidly expanding. There's just an explosion of new people. And the Bible gives us right here two main reasons to this population growth. One, people had longer lifespans pre-flood. All right, so God here says, I'm going to stop that because they're flesh. They're going to live 120 years because the flood's coming here in just a chapter or two. But we also see this intermarrying of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So, who are the sons of God here in Genesis chapter 6? This is a tough one. I think you could really go one of two ways about it. Either way doesn't really matter to how our lesson comes into play tonight. So we're just going to take the easy road out, and we're going to look at the sons of God being from that lineage of Seth. All right? The sons of God were God-fearing, God-believing, faithful men. The daughters of man were descendants of Cain. These were unfaithful, didn't know God, sinful, wicked people. In fact, it says here that that their hearts were only evil continually. That's the kind of people that we're dealing with. God-fearing, faithful, godless, wicked. All right, these are the two people. And now they begin to intermarry. Moses tells us that the righteous men of God viewed women with covetous eyes. They were lusting after the women by what they saw, and they ignored their hearts. They ignored the sin in their hearts and their lifestyle that they chose as they lived an ungodly life. The results of this are just tragic. As these wicked offspring continued to multiply, the transgressions of God continued to multiply as well. Again, the more sinners you have in life, as they continue to expand, so do the sins that they commit. So as sinners grow and the population of sinners grows, the amount of sin that the earth is dealing with continues to grow. And as a result, God's blessing upon man becomes corrupted, it becomes perverted, and ultimately it becomes cursed. So what did the world look like here in Genesis chapter 6? How would you describe the world? Was it a good place? Was it God-fearing? I didn't read God-fearing anywhere in those few verses. What did we see? Anarchy, particularly against God. Wicked. Every imagination, every heart, every thought was evil, and it was continuously increasing. It sounds like it, at least if you turn on the TV for long enough. It's not a very pretty picture, right? It is a picture filled with sin and violence and wickedness and everything opposite of what is good and holy and righteous. And this union between the godly and the ungodly leads to this description of the world that we see here, where God says it was the wickedness of man was great in the earth. The earth was corrupted. It was filled with violence. The Lord regretted that He had even made the earth. That's what the text says. God regretted creating humanity. That's how wicked it was. But in His grace and in His love for man, God finds favor in Noah. Again, it's this pattern that Steve talked about on Sunday night. Sin, punishment, and renewal. This wickedness of man that's multiplying across the earth, that's the sin. God destroying the earth is the punishment, but God repopulating the earth through the descendants of Noah is the renewal through those descendants. Okay? And we all know the story, so let's take a look at our next portrait of Noah. Turn over to Genesis chapter 9. We know the story of the flood. When the water finally subsides, there's 8 people that are righteous left on earth from all of the wicked God had destroyed. And it's not just man, God destroyed all of it. Even the creeping things. And I don't do creeping things, so I don't have a problem with that. But the birds, the creeping things, the animals, man, all of it, God destroyed all of them. The problem is, even though we only have 8 people, sin immediately comes right back into humanity. Let's look at chapter 9. I'm going to read verse 20 through 27. Chapter 9, verse 20 through 27. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." All right, so what incident here following the flood shows us that sin is still present even after everything is gone except for 8 righteous people? What incident here that shows us sin is still present? That's one. I do think there's 2. Drunkenness for sure. You see, I like that too. Gossip, a mocking of his dad. You know, this idea of nakedness that's mentioned here, as well as being exposed in a tent. The language that's used in the Hebrew can point to sexual immorality, incestuous sexual sin. But we also have the drunkenness, and even the language that's used whenever it says that the youngest goes out, when Ham goes out of the tent. In the original Hebrew, it literally says he went out and proudly told them, like it was in a mocking sense. He's mocking the authority of his father. He's laughing at his dad who is passed out drunk in the tent. And this happens pretty quick. I mean, Noah is harvesting the soil, and along with whatever vegetation he is planting to live off of, also created this vineyard. And so one night he indulges in the fruit of his vine, and he gets drunk, he passes out, and whatever happens in that tent is sinful in nature. And because of it, one son is cursed to be servants for the other two brothers. And we know what happens to the land of Canaan. It is going to be taken over by Abraham here in just a few short chapters. This is also the first time we get any mention of drunkenness in the Bible. So we talked about the first murder earlier. Now we got the first person that has indulged himself too much in the good wine. And we see the sin that happens when you fall into the abuse of alcohol and drunkenness. And it happens just that quick. Again, like Steve talked about, we have this pattern. We have sin, we have punishment, we have renewal, we have the drunkenness, we have possibly the sexual depravity. Canaan, the son of Ham, was cursed as the punishment. But the renewal, that the sons of the nations were born from the descendants of Noah. And so there are good, God-fearing people that come out of the other two sons and their descendants. And so we have, again, this sin, God destroys everything, and sin immediately pops back in. And these were the righteous people, right? These were the ones that God considered right. The only family that he spared still struggling with sin. And God continuing to forgive and redeem and offer a way out for them. But things continue to escalate. So let's flip over to chapter 11. Let's look at another portrait of how God's going to continue to redeem us from sin. Chapter 11, we're going to look at verses 1 through 9. And we all know this story well too. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Let me stop for a second. So at the end of chapter 10, what we see is the sons of Noah and their descendants are all kind of living in these communities. They all share the same language, but they're living together. We get here to chapter 11 when we turn the page, and now all of a sudden, they're this one language and the same words. Now we're going to see all of them are going to start to come together, right? God wanted them to spread out and populate the earth, but they're all coming back together. Verse 2, and as this people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, I don't know how you pronounce that one, and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we disappear over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore the name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. All right, so chapter 10, all Noah's descendants, and they were living in smaller communities, all shared the same language, but for whatever reason, they decided to come together. They were going to, as a collective group, build a great city, and they were going to build a giant tower. Why did they want to build the tower? Do what? They wanted to get up, they wanted to reach heaven. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They were trying to get to God, right? They wanted to see if they could reach the heavens. I think it's interesting that they choose a plain and not at the top of the tallest mountain. Like, let's start at the highest point, not the lowest valley, right? It's just what men do. But they were trying to make a name for themselves. And we can see the hearts of these men and their disobedience against God because God wanted them to fill the earth. But here they are actually coming together, right? Sharing the same language and the same purpose. They were trying to avoid this idea of being separated. Even in the materials that they're using, when you really dive into the text, we can actually see what their intentions were. They used baked bricks and they used asphalt for mortar. This is the same stuff that Noah used on his boat. Super strong and watertight, right? It's almost like they didn't trust that God, whenever he said, I'll never flood the earth again. No, we're going to build a great city, God, and we're going to build it really strong. We're going to fortify it, and it's going to be waterproof in case you ever make it rain for 40 days again, right? You see the disobedience even in the materials that they're using. And we also see their lack of faith in God when they choose to not trust his word when he says, this will never happen again, and I want you to go and fill the earth and populate all the face of the earth. So why did God keep them from building the tower? Look at verse 6. Behold, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Right? It's this exaltation of self. Right? They're putting themselves above God. It's what we talked about a minute ago. It's the greatest sin of all humanity. God, I know you have a plan and a purpose, but we know better. You want us to do this, but I think if we do that, we will actually be a little bit more successful and productive. And on the surface, it sounds great, right? Instead of having a village of 1,000, let's have a village of 30,000. Let's share the resources. Let's come together. Like that, I understand that mindset, but that's not what God intended. And anytime you go against God, the results are always devastating. Not only that, but I think the disobedience, this is how God punishes you when you disobey his commands and his words. You want to do A, and he makes you do B, whether you like it or not.
God is a jealous God. I told you no. And that's
Mm-hmm. I don't care if you want to, the answer is no. So when God said nothing would be withheld from them, what was he referring to? What was he meaning? I think there's this idea here of collective power of sin. The evil that man is capable of when we come together. You don't really have to think that hard. I mean, just look back over the 20th century and how man, all the wicked and evil man has done, and the hundreds of millions of people that were murdered for political gain, for individual power and wealth, right? Bad things happen when a lot of sinful people come together. The results are never good. And so God didn't want them to, whenever God says nothing can be withheld from them, I mean, almost anything, as long as you have resources and manpower, I mean, you can build great pyramids that we can't build today, right? There's things that you can accomplish that seem unfathomable. And that's what God's referring to. Again, and we see in all of this same pattern: sin, punishment, and renewal. Man wants to be like God. Man wants to build a tower to God. Man wants to disobey God's plans and God's purposes. And so the punishment is they're scattered. Their languages are scattered. They can no longer communicate with one another. So whether they have plans or not, they can't understand the other guy. So they're scattered across the face of the earth. And the renewal, enter Abraham. All right, let's look at our next portrait. And we're kind of wrapping up. The portrait of Abraham is really next week, but we'll try to frame it up tonight. Just turn the page, one page, chapter 12. This is when God starts to enter into his covenantal relationship with man. We've had sin, we've had opportunity for forgiveness, we've had grace and love, and we've had punishment that results from it, but God continues to offer man a way out. And so as we turn into Genesis chapter 12, we start to see God's covenant begin to play out. And we're not going to read anything here. We'll save that for next week. But God's going to make 3 promises to Abraham here in chapter 12. He's going to promise him that he's going to make him a great nation, and the nation will come from his descendants. This nation will be in the land of Canaan. So we have the promise of the promised land. And then we also have that he's going to bless all of the nations throughout all of the earth through his seed. Now, the ESV says offspring. Most other translations is going to say seed. and that seed is what's continuing to point us to Jesus. Because that's how Paul refers to Jesus in Galatians chapter 3. It says, now the promises that were made to Abraham and to his seed, offspring, he does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one seed, and to your seed who is Christ. Right? So Paul in Galatians is pointing us to Genesis and saying whenever he talks about that seed that comes from Abraham, he's not talking about many seeds, he's talking about one seed, and that one seed is the Christ. And so even Paul is pointing us back to this moment here in Genesis chapter 12. Over the last 2 weeks, we've really kind of focused on a couple of verses that really help us frame up the background for what the Bible has in plan for humanity. And I love these 3 verses. I want to spend the next 5 minutes that we have, the last 5 minutes, just kind of breaking these down because it's good stuff. The first one is Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. And this is the sin, right? Sin, punishment, and renewal. These are going to be our 3 verses. Genesis 3, 6. So when the woman saw that their tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was also to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Right? This is the introduction of sin into the world. Now, guys that like to point to the woman for causing sin to come into the world, if you'll back up one chapter, God instructed Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam did not pass that message along to his wife. The instruction comes through the husband as the leader of the home. It's not on Eve. This is 100% on Adam. Adam got that instruction. Eve did not obey that instruction because she didn't receive it. Okay? Side note. Now, what y'all talked about last week is what's here in 3:6. Sin is the foundational source of every negative experience common to man. Sin is what causes us to suffer. Sin is what brings all the suffering into the world. God is not to blame for sin. God is not to blame for suffering. And so our rebellion against God that is to blame for the sin and the suffering that we have to deal with in life. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around that. Just in the last day and a half at work, I've had one employee whose daughter took her life, had another employee whose grandfather had a stroke and is in the hospital, and then at the end of the day today, another employee whose mom had multiple mini strokes today and is in the hospital. It spirals out of control just at the drop of a dime. The suffering is real, and none of us are immune to it. That is sin, and it has been here from the beginning. And there's nothing we can do about it except for obey and trust and put our faith in God and His plans and purposes. Understanding that because we live in a sinful world and in sinful flesh, we will fall short daily. But there is redemption in God through Christ. Right? Now, the second verse is Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and this is the punishment. Now, I really love this verse. So it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, what I love about this is this is not God's punishment to man. This is actually the inverse. This is the second part of God's curse for sin, and this is that the descendants of Satan and the animosity that God puts between Satan and mankind. Not only do we have a healthy fear and a natural fear of God, just in being human, the Bible clearly tells us that we know God is real, we know that God exists, and it is our flesh that rejects that, but the same is true for evil. Wherever there's good, there's evil. Wherever there's light, there's dark. The opposite is also true, that we have a natural, healthy fear of sin and evil. We are naturally afraid of burning in hell, right? We are naturally afraid of the evil that comes from sin. We are afraid of the suffering that this life will bring to us through no fault of our own because of sin. This is what God is talking about here in verse 15. That is the punishment. Not only are we going to be punished for sin, but we are also Satan is also going to be punished because we are going to be aware of who he is and all of his tricks, whether you obey God or not. That is part of how all of this is playing out. Enmity is actually the idea of ill will, hatred, antagonism. Okay? So man now has this natural hatred towards Satan. And in the same way we're born naturally rebellious to God, we are cautiously fearful of Satan and evil. The third one is the renewal. This is from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Just as the forbidden tree in Genesis chapter 2 gave man the opportunity to show his faithfulness to God, every law, every precept, every command from Genesis 6 onward is God providing man with the means and the opportunity to express his love and obedience to God in faith. All of it from Genesis, once sin enters the world, from Genesis 6, once sin happens, the rest of the text is going to give us a way out. It's going to give us an opportunity to express our love and our faith to God in a variety of ways. At the end of the day, it is that love expressed through our faith in Christ, who is the Redeemer, that is going to provide us a way for salvation. Paul says it this way. He says that faith is the means of accessing the grace of God. That's Romans 5:2. He also says that Paul describes that faith is the obedience of faith. So faith goes beyond just a word, and it's the obedience to his purposes and plans are. He describes it as works of faith. So because we have faith, that should be lived out in our lives in all that we do, in the things that we say, how we treat other people, and how we interact with the world around us. And faith is also working through love. That's Galatians 5, chapter 6. So, in closing, I'm just going to read these from the material because I thought this was interesting. Those in heaven will be there because they submitted to God's grace and obedient faith, and they enjoy the benefit of God's plan to curse the problem of sin. I like that. That's why we will be in heaven. We obey God. We submit to His grace. We submit to Him in faith, and we understand that the curse of sin, and we will be blessed because of our actions and because of our faith. Those in hell will be there because they never responded to God's grace and obedient faith, or having done so, failed to persevere to the end. So, last thing, ice cream social, Sunday night, after evening worship. That's my last little bullet point right there at the bottom. Told Trey I wouldn't forget. Questions, thoughts, comments? I haven't heard a bell, but it is 49 after. I would assume that's about time to go get kids. I think most of us don't have a look. We got a few. A few. Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. So that's our third lesson as we're taking a 30,000-foot view over the text and seeing how God's plan for redeeming man is going to play out. I think we all know the end, but it's still a good story. Y'all have a good night.